By the time you see this, you'll know what we don't, which is the result of the disability cuts vote in the Commons, the revised package, which will now only put 150,000 people into poverty. And that's this year, because next year, of course, is a whole new ball game for those wishing to sign up to PIP. We speculate on what that is meaning for Labour Party support, for Keir Starmer's personal authority and popularity. We look also at last week's question time. I was a panellist on that, having just been stung in the throat by a wasp. Draw no parallels or importance from that, other than it was a strange way to prepare. And obviously the big events of the week, Iran, Israel, Palestine, Kneecap, Bob Vylan, and the BBC's decisions to broadcast and not broadcast, which are inadvertently helping to promote artists who are the only people able to bring this issue to the forefront. We must have national demonstrations now because nothing else is moving the politicians. Those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Well, hi folks, and welcome to this week's Lesley Riddick podcast. It's a week where the English middle classes at Glasgow went from Jeremy Corbyn to fuck Keir Starmer. The BBC went from being big, bold and doing as they were told by no platforming the Irish group Kneecap, only for Bob Vylan to up the ante and what is shaping up to be a career-ending moment for the Director-General of the BBC, Tim Davie. Lesley, you were in Ullapool and now you're in Stornoway. Has any of this froth reached you? And what else have you been up to this week?
No, the froth. Well, the froth kind of hasn't, although I'm obviously, just about managing to see what's happening online. But, it's not the talk of the steamy yet for everybody, but then perhaps I have been doing other things. I was showing the film about Applecross in Ullapool, which might seem a bit confusing. And it ended up then that we had a big debate about the other big issue in the Highlands, which is the sort of, wind farms planned everywhere, which it would have to be said, lots of yesers just don't understand why the Scottish Government is using its planning powers to nod most of these things through. So it's been that kind of focus up till now. And I'm here in Stornoway for a conference, which is part of NORA, which is an acronym that is basically the North Atlantic small states meet as part of the Nordic Council I think it's every year, maybe every other year, and they've been doing it since the 1970s. So I think this is the first time in 50 years it's come to Scotland. So that's a great thing. The place is, in the hotel I'm in at the moment, there's so many sort of blonde people speaking slightly clipped English around that I think it's a wash with Faroese people, basically. And I was dying to speak to them, but of course, had to do this. So I'll speak to them soon. So that's been, and apart from, but we'll probably get to it, I got stung by a wasp in the throat last week, which was exciting and landed me in A&E for an afternoon before I ended up doing question time, which, it's a kind of unusual preparation technique, I'd say that.
It certainly is. Float like a butterfly, sting like a wasp. I mean, question time was a pretty unusual affair. Seemed to be very staid. I mean, you were the only kind of fully live human being that was on it. What was your experience?
It was very strange. I mean, I see the National had a front page the next day, which was complaining about Thomas Kerr, the councillor who used to be a Tory and is now Reform, being on the panel instead of the Greens, basically, or, why? And I mean, certainly there is that, although if you look at the success they had in the last by-election, and their projected vote, they would exceed quite a lot of parties, including the Tories. Although it is a fair point that they ain't there yet. If we're going to kind of start allocating chairs and time according to what people are projected to get in a future election that's still, a year away, then the lineups of everything could look very different. But anyway, he was there. So, and he was the last one on, actually. The rest of us were all there. If you like, there's two Indie, two Unionist. And then they stuck Thomas Kerr on at the end towards the last minute. But I mean, what is it with people? It was tremendously, I just hit my bat and say my little bit. And everybody was, I think, sitting with, there's a big hole in my case about everything. And if I just play reasonably straight bats and nice, perhaps the other panelists won't have a go at me because because they've also got something I could wire into them about. So Anas Sarwar was sitting, obviously, with all the disability stuff yet to happen the next day, I think. The climb down happened within a day or two. Still having, choosing to say that this was a brand new set of proposals. It was all going to happen. It was perfectly fine. So I think he was, and he came out batting in his, the usual, hey, I'm Anna Sarwar. It's all going to be okay. I'm relaxed. Look at me, kind of thing. Although in the war, I don't remember if it was in the warm up or in another part. A woman asked him a question and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name," which was a bit of a moment, for a man who would be first minister.
Yeah, that
Um,
was broadcast. That was,
was it? Was it
I'm
okay?
sorry, I'm not sure who you are. The Labour representative is almost kind of how it came out and stuff. I'm a bit hard of hearing, and it cut back to his face. But he didn't come across as a leader, particularly, in as much as that he didn't stand out amongst the rest of the candidates, the rest of the panel, rather. If you're there and you've decided to take up that gig as party leader rather than sending somebody else along to spout out the Labour line, you have to, I would have thought, be, 20% better at least than the person sitting next to you. And that didn't come across.
Actually, that's a good point, which I really hadn't thought about, which was just essentially the pecking order etiquette of all this. Because you're quite right. Normally, if you're a party leader, you absolutely wouldn't come on unless you were with similar ranking, other party leaders. So why do you think, in that case, why do you think he came on? I mean, that does sound like they obviously think he's a big asset and were kind of a bit desperate to maybe not confident to have anybody else on.
I mean, I think it's mostly about showing him around. I mean, the Labour Party are still spending quite a bit of money on social media advertising, particularly on YouTube, in target seats. I'm in East Lothian, and all throughout the period of last year's general election, loads of YouTube adverts. And then subsequently, which I think is much more interesting, they're still spending money every month telling me, we're halfway there. We're doing such great stuff in the rest of the UK. And now you need to get Labour in Scotland. So I think it's a bit about getting him out there and bringing up his profile. But that's a double-edged sword if you go out there and your profile diminishes. It didn't come across as a leader, and certainly wasn't kind of cutting across as a future First Minister, and didn't really have much more above the Glasgow Town Councillor that was sitting to his right-hand side.
Right, the Glasgow Town Councillor being
Your man from
oh right,
Reform.
I think he was on the other side
Well,
actually, but so on his right hand
stage
side was
left.
I think yes indeed. Yes, indeed. Was Andrew Bowie from the Tories, who actually threw me at one point because I did a couple of rants, one of which was about kindergarten and just getting it right for children at the start. And strangely enough, Andrew Bowie kind of weighed in and said, "I don't think I'm ever going to say these words again, but I totally agree with Lesley on this." And the reason is, I think, his wife is Swedish, and we were speaking beforehand. They were going off to Sweden. I said, "Oh, you'll be going off to the summer house then?" He went, "Yep." I said, "Yeah, lovely swimming in the in the fjords and just good crack, everyone relaxed." Yep. I said, why do you not think we want that here?" And he just kind of shrugged and said, "Yeah, actually, that there's no reason." So that was a bit of an odd one. But coming back to Alice and to Shirley Ann Somerville, I kind of was surprised really that Shirley Ann didn't get wired in more because obviously Annis was like a sitting target really with all that stuff going wrong. But she sat in the blizzard of all his long recitation of, and I can't even remember them now, but there's this level of, I'm not belittling these waiting lists, by the way. I mean, I'm on one, but a waiting list for cancer patients, a waiting list for this. You can always chuck the ferries in for good measure, and you can always stick the blooming ferries in for good measure. So there's a kind of, they've been in for nearly 20 years. There's a whole stack of things that aren't really working very well. But what really kind of what got me, what sort of switched the back of my head was hearing him and Thomas Kerr, I mean, for crying in a bucket, going on about how everything needed more money and needed more investment on the day that, first of all, the day after Keir Starmer had just casually pledged 48 billion in extra defence spending. Now, I mean, that in terms of talking about your black holes, that knocks Rishi Sunak's 20 billion black hole into a cocked hat. We're not even talking about it. And on Thomas Kerr's side, oh, wasn't he the guy that, was supported the side of the bus that had 350 million a week, was it, going to go into the NHS? What happened to that then? So it's kind of, there's points where something said by these guys, because you've got to jar this debate up a bit. They'll all sit and say, poke holes in current policy and spending. But if anyone turns around and says, "Well, so how much more are you going to spend?" I mean, what are you going to do other than just say we're the other guys? And I'll quite grant you, there's a stage in politics where just being the other guys gets you through sometimes. But these guys needed to be put through their paces. And I would honestly, there's no point in even saying this, but I would cheerfully give some advice to the blooming SNP ministers as to how you go in with a couple of attack lines where your rivals are weak and you rehearse it with yourself as to how you might come in and get a few key facts and figures. And when somebody crosses your threshold, like a kind of spider sitting in the middle of your web, you feel the vibration and you go, right, off we go.
Yeah, we're having this.
We're having this fun.
The PIP stuff was obviously the most obvious, and later on today, this afternoon, the welfare bill will have its second reading. This is the largest ever backbench rebellion, I think, in living memory. It's a huge upset to the Labour Party. I watched a little bit of the ministerial statement yesterday afternoon. It didn't seem to me like the majority of backbenchers were saying, oh, well, that's all right then. There has been a partial climb down saying that the new changes won't take effect until November 2026. And those people already claiming benefits of the PIP and the health element of universal credit will not be affected by the new changes. But, of course, everybody else will.
Yeah, and I mean, I saw somewhere in the midst of it all a really moving account from somebody who I think had multiple sclerosis and was, yes, a lot of these conditions have stages. And she was saying, I was am I supposed to regard myself as lucky that my MS got to the stage of needing support this year so that I became a claimant this year? And, she said, with all the folk that are around me, they thought they were lucky if they were managing to hold off needing that support for a while, whereas now they won't qualify. And it sort of brought it just completely home to you how utterly ludicrous this is. I mean, another thing that I had a wee Google to find again, which I'm surprised hasn't been made more of, but this is slightly, it's just people come on and repeat their mantras, but it's a point that I made during that debate, that the minister, the relevant minister, Stephen Timms, I'm not doing sir with all these people. I mean, what the fuck? Stephen Timms, who's the minister for some of this stuff, Minister for Social Security and Disability, was before the relevant committee and was asked if he accepted that working age social security spending had remained level at about 5% for the last decade. And so basically, Stephen Timms accepted that. The reason that the number of PIP recipients had risen was to demographic change, we're getting older, the nation's poor health, very relevant point actually, and that's a whole bigger ball game we need to talk about. And the increase in the state pension age, which means there's about 87,000 pensioners who used to get a pension. Pension age gets bopped up. They have got some issues, and so they're beginning to claim disability benefits. £100 a week, I think, is basic universal credit. So the pension is about £200 a week. Now, I could be wrong on those figures, but I think that's generally it. So, we're sitting with lots of issues sitting in the midst of all that. But the point that Debbie Abrahams, who was the committee chair, kept pushing over and over again is that this thing of a massive, we can hardly, a wave of disability claimants wasn't basically true, and that so much of it was due to cost of living challenges. And actually, Stephen Timms accepted that.
Yeah, and I think particularly on the question time and some of the rounder reporting around this area has been on the focus that a perceived increase in the young fit people who have perceived mental health issues and are using that to avoid work. But of course, PIP is there to cover the extra costs associated with disability. It's not an income replacement. And I think it's worth us remembering that, of course, these benefits, PIP is devolved in Scotland. It's adult disability payment. There's something like 433,000 people in Scotland on ADP. And our system is designed to be fairer and more dignified. So, for example, instead of the claimant having to run round and go to their GP and get letters and confirmation of their diagnosis and evidence, the Social Security system, Social Security Scotland, will do that sort of thing for you. So using the information that is already held by the state. You know, watching the debate yesterday in the House of Commons, they're creating this two-tier system, and I think primarily to avoid the pain that was going to be brought about by reassessing the existing PIP claimants, because those were going to be very visible to local MPs.
Sorry, I sort of missed the point of that. Then the compromise is to try to kind of, well, obviously, it's to try
Well,
and
if you push it into new claimants, that becomes
yeah,
something that's handled by Department for Work and Pension. If you try to reassess everybody or change a huge proportion of people's existing claims, that washes right up in the front doorstep of your local MP. And I forget what the percentages are, but there's a huge number of PIP appeals. I mean, more than 50% of PIP appeals are upheld at tribunal. And there's been a lot of kind of social media froth about scroungers and the fact that there are various online guides and bulletin boards as to how to score better. The majority of these are about making sure that people answer the questions in the way that they're supposed to do. We're not asking, can you do this sometimes, or on your good day, would you be okay for that? The assessment is there to cover you on your worst day. And some people can be caught out by kind of underplaying their own condition rather than really focusing on when the times are at their worst. And they end up underscoring on things that they shouldn't be doing. And in general terms, their condition is much worse than they have been able to get across.
But in the meantime, I mean, it's tonight the vote. I mean, where do you think they are with this? Because it does sound like, the media have got a couple of lines that they just start cranking out that, oh well, this is still 150,000 people being pushed into poverty by this, and how a Labour MP can vote for that still, defeats me. But on the other hand, the original reasoned amendment, which would have crashed the bill, has been withdrawn. But there's another reasoned amendment in, which at the moment has got about 40 or 50 signatories, which ain't enough to basically rock the boat.
Yeah, I mean, as I think we speculated before, I think they'll have basically done enough to push it out. This is 2026, we're going to have a variety of other reports in the meantime and changes to assessment criteria, and everything will be finessed in the background. But we need this enabling bill, and we can't have a defeat for this new government. So I think that the backbenchers will climb down, and I think enough of them will have been whipped and corralled to support the party. But this has been a big shock, and it's been a hugely damaging period for the Prime Minister, who was out in the Sundays interviewing the Times, basically taking his eye off the ball and far too distracted by NATO and Iran and other matters to concentrate on the welfare bill. And it's also another unforced error. They stacked this bill up and wanted to get this through without really sort of making sure that they had the support on side for their backbenchers. And it's coming ahead of other changes in other reports. It's not been designed in conjunction with disabled people or their advocates. And instead of working through a process and doing the hard yards and then coming up with a bill, they seem to have come up with a really kind of bold or harsh piece of legislation a bit like taking the winter fuel payment away, when that's what the Labour Party wanted to demonstrate to the markets and others, that they were taking the difficult decisions and they were making the changes and the tough choices and blah, blah, blah. They've done this really kind of in a topsy-turvy order. They've not taken people with them, and it's further weakened the Prime Minister.
You would think, though, that, after the backlash there was to the winter fuel payment and the sort of forced U-turn, it would give you a wee clue. I mean, I imagine by then they were locked and loaded into, just now they've set all these hairs running at the same time. So actually, even though they can see that they're beginning to hit real, huge public opposition and being seen as real mean, can't quite use the word here, but, a mean bunch of people, they couldn't pull that back, or could they? The disability cuts.
I think they could have slowed the parliamentary timeline down if they'd wanted to, or if they'd really thought about it. And my kind of central premise here is that they seem to be taking all of the political pain in these ideas, not being able to get any of them through, you turning too late to actually avoid some of the negativity, and they get all the pain, all the poor reputation, and all of the kind of change in sentiment for ordinary voting people without actually making any of the changes and getting anything they wanted to happen. So you get all the pain and none of the gain.
Yeah, even Rod Stewart says, back Nigel Farage now, for crying in a bucket. But I mean, yeah, I know.
A listener wrote in with a pun, because you can take the boy out of the podcast, but not the podcast out of the boy. And he was suggesting, do you really loathe me?
Okay, right. Yeah. Well, but the other thing is the sort of loathing that's developing now for Keir Starmer. I mean, there's so much talk about his leadership, Sugarly Peg, all the rest of it, but also the key lieutenants. Liz Kendall, Rachel Reeves. That they're all now they feel like quite tarnished individuals within all of this, and that's not even to get onto the apology for the island of strangers lark. I also wondered, people have asked me, who is Fraser? He's great, but who is he? So, because you've been keeping incognito, but I mean, you were the office manager for Joanna Cherry for how many years?
Yeah, worked for Joanna Cherry as their sort of senior parliamentary assistant for 7 years or so.
Right.
And
you'll notice the careful correction of the title there, folks.
Well,
it matters, not state.
Well, office manager, I mean, you can be called anything you want, basically. But sometimes office managers are just there to make sure that, there's adequate stationery supplies. When you get to work in a small office, as I did, you basically get to literally replumb the toilet and fix the door handle, and meet the Prime Minister and try to make intelligent conversation and push things forward for big campaigns like the female Afghan judges, trying to repatriate female Afghan judges, or lead kind of press type stuff around the prorogation case, if you remember Joanna, in the Cherry case, whacking Boris Johnson in his unlawful closure of Parliament.
Oh, I thought you were going to say in an unlawful sort of physical situation.
Well, no, I think she would perhaps draw the line at that. But
so there you are, a bit of a sketch in. You'll get more. I mean, we'll get more as we drop this event. I'm always somebody that's interested in accents. You're from Bute.
I'm from the Isle of Bute. Yes, I don't know whether I've got an Isle of Bute accent, but I suppose I've definitely got some kind of West Coast accent.
Mm-hmm. Right. Island of Strangers. Right. So Keir Starmer came out and said basically, I hadn't reread the speech properly and it was popped in there. And I just, found myself reading it going, oh God, but it was too late then. And out it came. I mean, I've seen commentators coming back saying, please just don't come it. There would have been a little army of SPADs and special advisors and people looking over that speech, and it would have been, that was okayed by people pretty high up the food chain.
Unquestionably, and calculated and calibrated, and can we really get away with putting that in? And well, actually, that's probably quite a good way for us to, really sound tough. And I would have thought that things like that, where you're taking it to the edge, would have actually been drawn to his attention. And frankly, even if you are in the kind of, George W. Bush, I don't really read things until they're in front of me, or I just expect people to come and have a chat because if you think I'm going to read that report, you're up a gum tree. Don't tell people. Is this in any way a redeeming interview to suggest, oh, well, I didn't really mean that. And yes, I might be Prime Minister of the entire country, but, I don't read set piece speeches because I'm awful busy thinking about other things.
Yeah,
Bizarre.
it's no part of it is a good look at all. And I don't know where we're going, but in this, but there's by contrast, I was this guy Zoran Kwame Mamdani. I have to say this quite carefully. Has become the Democrats' candidate for New York City mayor. And you might think, so what about that? But this is a kind of different approach completely, because this is extraordinary. He's had anti-Muslim stuff full on since that nomination began. He was just given no chance whatsoever of getting the nomination. He describes himself as a socialist. He's anti-capitalism. He's got, but he's got a great sense of humor. He's very personable. He also, during part of his campaign, was to walk the entire length of Manhattan, speaking to people. He started at 7 o'clock one Friday evening and finished about 4 o'clock in the morning, speaking to people and big social media. You were talking about social media with Labour, but there was so many kind of frames of him meeting New Yorkers, you getting big claps for the next mayor, sort of walking through the night and meeting the kind of people who are around on late shift, early shift, all that kind of stuff. So he's beaten the most unbelievable bunch of mainstream establishment democratic figures, and and is obviously speaking particularly for Generation Z or younger people who are just really impressed with the sort of grassroots ground game essentially that he put in there. And it kind of makes you just think, well, it's quite a refreshing thing. We might put a link in to just one of the videos of him because he's totally pushed on, are you a socialist? And just says, yes, I am. And, and quizzed on capitalism and so on. And he doesn't flinch. He doesn't give way, but he doesn't sound sort of, he doesn't sound humorless or kind of, he sounds like someone who wants to make you understand that the alternatives he's being given to choose between are pretty poor. And what he's wanting is just a lot more support for everybody, at the grassroots, small businesses, all this kind of lark. So I just thought that was a little ray of sunshine myself.
Yeah, definitely fascinating. He's like a way cooler version of Rory Stewart with the walking about. And wants to make New York livable for the people who actually live there, not for Wall Street.
Yeah.
And it says, this is a victory for a vision of the city that every New Yorker can afford. And that's what's won.
But to me, this is kind of pretty, that just the way you phrased that. It's so important that, make it work for the people who live there, because that's what I've been getting big style across the Highlands, because it's not just the question of, wind farms going up everywhere and you've still got the highest energy bills and nobody can explain to you why that's okay. But there's a whole extractive economy thing. Tourism is just, it's kind of, there's pretty much over tourism without provision. I met a young woman that I've known for quite a long time in Ullapool, and she's trying to move house. She's only hoping she's found someone who's a local who might just be selling their house, and she would have to be persuading that person to lose a lot of money to basically sell it to her privately, so it doesn't go in the open market and get bought by as a holiday home. And I can't believe we're still at this. And it's like people who are out with this area, just I don't know if they think it's stopped becoming an issue, or whatever. Yeah, you read stuff about the North Coast 500, but it's a long way away. You haven't been, it's probably a bad day on the roads and it'll get better the next day. It just doesn't get better. And I mean, in other places, in Spain, in the Canaries, there's massive protests happening now by people who are pointing out they can't live because of tourism coming in. A friend of mine is doing a piece for Al Jazeera about this and was saying, yeah, there's people in the Canaries who are living in caravans a lot of the year and working as service workers, and there's no homes for them. And I thought, there's people been living in caravans in the Highlands for my entire life. It was a thing. I don't know if I did it on Butte. People used to get out of their own houses in the summer and live in a caravan so that they could rent out the house to try and make some money. But I mean, that's gone now. It's just like permanently people are living on the margins. Those guys are angry as hell, and they're doing things like gluing up the wee boxes that people, the key drop boxes that
Yeah.
people use for Airbnb pickups. And they're actually spraying people in the face with water. Of course, it would be it's pretty blooming alarming to get anything sprayed in your face because you don't know what it is. And they know it's alarming and people have been arrested, but they still, there's a sort of anger level there, which seems to be present here in the, quietly if you speak to people and isn't finding a kind of political manifestation. And I really think the SNP in particular need to watch out because if they don't start dealing with some of this, there's going to be, I think, a lot of losses in the Highland area for them.
Yes, it's a big worry. And, there are, as you've highlighted in Blossom and elsewhere in Thrive, that, there are policy solutions to these problems. And other places like Venice, for example, are taking more action to deal with them.
Well, the thing is that then that it's that like we are the ultimate feudal society, so we've got whatever problems everywhere else has, sort of with knobs on, and yet it's a general problem with places people like to visit. The visitors have more clout, more cash. If governments are only oriented towards an idea that prosperity comes from getting on your knees and servicing whoever appears, um, you'll get what now emerges. But a lot of that, again, seems to me to be that people who are in the Highlands here have got one council that's about the same size as Belgium, and they have got no ability to get to grips with their own area because it's just a tiny, tiny fraction of probably the world's biggest council. So it's a sair fecht, but the blimmin' structures are all wrong, and nobody wants to talk about that.
No, quite indeed. And, we're talking about local infrastructure investment, housing, at the same time that the UK government is telling us that we need to increase spending to NATO. And there's a big NATO summit last week.
Yes, and this is something I'd kind of picked up um, on in the question time. I mean, one thing that's interesting, and I wonder if I've still got this fact and figure in my head, but when people are talking about and they're looking at the UK versus Russia or Poland versus Russia, and I was watching, the Peston program, and the graphs that were put up there were showing that all of these are, the Western countries are all lower than Russia. And then somebody, online was making the pretty strong point, but what about all of us together? Because together, NATO with the United States has 10 times the Russian military force. Without America, the European bits of NATO have 3 times the Russian force. Now, with nuclear arms, there's more of a parity, but the reason for that is because the successive negotiations and deterrent programs have kept Russia and, if you like, the West in rough sync. A rough sync which could be now beginning to break down, not directly because of Russia, but because of the US and Israeli attacks on Iran. Because Iran I think the day of question time last week, so what was that, Thursday, um, Iran voted to leave the non-proliferation treaty and to also leave the nuclear watchdog that comes in and looks around at their stuff. One of the reasons being that it's widely believed, although they deny it, that the Israelis have 80 nuclear weapons, warheads, and they are not signed up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. So, the Iranians are saying, okay, so, and just by the by, they're saying they now have nearly 1,000 people dead as a result of those attacks. So they have had that casualty. They're seeing Israel, who is not kind of getting any of the pelters for being the initiators of an attack that they think should happen. If people were serious about non-proliferation and kind of non-first and all that stuff. Now, of course, Iran is a horrible regime, but still, the net of it is, as predicted. that the Saudis have a feeling of rough parity with Iran. If they think Iran, and they've already said, if Iran drops out of the NPT, the Saudis might well do, the Egyptians might well do. And then you begin to see this whole thing fall to pieces. So it seems to me, and I'm no expert, but there's a huge amount more significance to what happened there than a sort of gotcha moment. And I have to say, quite repelled by the suggestion that there is around the place that, okay, you might not like Donald Trump, but he certainly taught those, nasty Iranians a bit of a lesson. I mean, it's just, of course, history doesn't exactly repeat itself, because if it did exactly repeat itself, even slow-minded people might spot that there's something familiar. So there's maybe just a little bit of a change. It's a different kind of regime. It's a different aggressor. It's a different set of circumstances. But this thing that you think you can go in out of nowhere, because there was no imminent threat at the moment being placed by Iran on anybody more than yesterday, last month, last year. The thought that you can go in as Israel or the United States and just basically whack a country, come back out again and sort of go, jobs are good and those guys have backed down a bit, we've taken a few folk out, Bob's your uncle, all will be well. That's exactly where we were with Iraq. And, countless other situations. And yet, here we are, and we're going to end up with 48 billion extra being spent by 2030 on defence, which is part of what, again, I'm old enough to remember this, of basically escalating, ever escalating military spending on both sides. Because if we start spending, if Britain starts spending 48 billion extra, and Germans and all the rest of them will welly in, you end up with the other side perceiving that they have to end up spending that on weapons. And all the time, poor people are dying, the countries are and the kind of stresses that then create displacement through refugee movements, the lack of water, the lack of sanitation, the lack of everything is a low priority to everybody because they're so hell bent on having more weapons than the next guy. So it's grim.
It's very grim, and it's also, in some regards, a bit of a con. The skies of Messina are unco and grey, and all the Brichchommers are eerie, as Hamish Henderson would say. The Italians are saying that under the rules, you only have to spend 3.5% of GDP on actual military kit, and you can have another 1.5% on broadly defined series of investments loosely connected security infrastructure. And people have been thinking of having a bridge over the Straits of Messina since Roman times, which doesn't normally come, doesn't stack up economically or environmentally as viable when you brand it as a normal civic infrastructure. But if you need to get up to 5% GDP spending on defence, and you can whack your bridge and rebrand it as an infrastructure project connected to security infrastructure, then maybe that's a good way to help you make up the numbers.
Well, that's an interesting sideways take on it all. It just feels like there's nobody in you. If you try to even outline thinking that has been pretty mainstream for decades, that has looked at, we've been here so many times before, but as soon as you're trying to talk about non-proliferation, what a terrible word it is, and de-escalating and all the efforts that have to be put into that, and the idea that Donald Trump thought he was going to get a Nobel Peace Prize in the midst of all this. And he actually, it turns out he was nominated. The Pakistanis had nominated him because of some efforts he'd made to in some probably a dispute, that huge dispute they were having with India, but nonetheless they rated something he'd done on their behalf and nominated him for a Nobel Peace Prize. Now under huge pressure, I haven't checked again, but under so much pressure following the Iranian attack, for that to be withdrawn. And I think the Ukrainians were also on the verge of nominating him. So, why? But all of this nonsense, I mean, but still the levels of delusion. The thing that I couldn't get over was that Trump had retweeted a sort of some sort of meme thing or a little video that had gone, instead of Barbaran, the kind of Beach Boys single, it was Bomberan. And it goes through the whole thing. It's very compulsive in the sense of, if you're from that era and you know the Barbaran song, you're kind of looking for all the words, and all the words they use about bombing Iran fit exactly into the lyrics. But it's like the casualness of this now, and the sort of there was 1,000 people killed. There's their people as well. The same, it's just,
Yeah, it's ludicrous. And I think the whole GDP thing is a con. Why are we investing huge sums of money into armament? And where is the real, genuine threat? We seem to just be getting ramped up and up and up for no real purpose. And the Iranian attack, of course, was a bit of a distraction. This was, and equally all of this nonsense we've had this week about Kneecap and about Bob Vylan and chants at Glastonbury are really taking away from the hard facts on the ground, which is the fact that the Israeli army are killing civilians in Gaza every single day, and people queuing up for aid are being murdered.
yeah. And I mean, what more can any of us? Well, that is the only question now is, beyond these very outspoken artists managing to kind of frontline this scenario. And I noticed the National did a very good piece, which was actually looking at all the artists that had mentioned Palestine. It wasn't just those two. There was about 10 in total that had said something substantial before they performed. So everybody's trying to say all these things, and yet there's nothing. I'm wondering myself why there isn't a massive set of national rallies. Because maybe back in the day, I would have thought that something on this scale, like it's like the Iraq War, the levels of anger there are in the public about this, it needs some form of expression that's not just, social media, and there's nothing left to say more. I mean, Pat and I have been through months and months of this now, breaking down, trying to get the particular examples about children, but we're talking to ourselves. I mean, we all know this is appalling, and they just every new day, it's unbelievable. By the time you get to tea time, when we got to that on that question time day, they'd shot another 55 people. And they'll do another 55 today. I mean, there's nowhere on earth that you would let that happen in full public view. And nobody does anything. So I hope there'll be some big marches set up soon. And when I have a bit of time, I would try to find out what is on the go about it, because there's surely enough different groups that could put their efforts together to try and make that happen. And of course, the next thing that'll happen is the Palestine Action thing, and whether or not they'll be banned, I think has been bumped onto Friday as a Commons vote. Is it Friday?
I've not got the date in front of me. I don't think. I mean, this is. I think it's just an order that's being laid.
Right. So anyway, it comes out. I thought it was today, but I think it's later in the week. They're taking legal action against it. But I mean, quite obviously, the second, I would have thought the second they're banned, they have some kind of rally, and people who feel they're hard enough will turn up and just go, blimmin' convict us if you like, and absolutely push this. It might well be this is the way to push it, is since they've upped the ante, the way to get more publicity, and it's a big risk. Okay, there's the 14 years in jail, ludicrous possibility. And yet that also increases the public's understanding of those people who are willing to risk that, to stand literally with just a sign saying "Free Palestine." So I don't think this is over at all, but it needs to get somewhere before everybody think all this energy dissipates over the summer, which is pretty much we're there already.
Yep, and these actions to prescribe Palestine action have been criticised internally by Home Office officials. This is kind of similar to the BBC being told not to live broadcast Kneecap. It's only making people more interested. This is not coming about through some fringe movement. This is a mainstream public view that what is going on in Gaza is a genocide. It has to stop, and that the UK government are entirely complicit in it, providing arms and logistical infrastructure in order to make it happen. And the more it gets banned, the more people are going to want to watch it. I mean, you had the usual ridiculous situation when the BBC had banned Kneecap, that BBC News had a rolling website covering Glastonbury. So there was a live update of the news about what they were saying was being broadcast on a kind of ticker. But of course, you had to wait until later to actually watch it. And people like me, who probably would have had absolutely no interest in watching Glastonbury or Kneecap, had to go and seek it out to find out what was being said, and then watched it on the kind of live recap and got Bob Vylan chanting death to the IDF.
Yeah, which has been the subject of, there's been various commentaries about that, and people saying yes, it's talking not about Israelis. There was quite a lot of people picking up on a headline. I can't remember which paper it
It was the
was.
Daily Mail immediately turned it around to say that he'd
Yes.
called for the death of Israelis, but of course he had called for the death of a constituted army engaged in a war.
Which is also an army of occupation, all the rest of it. I mean, the thing is, it's like there's plenty of things I wouldn't, back in the day when I was pogoing around to Jolly Rotten, I wouldn't have, as being a nicely brought up girl, wouldn't have got on the stage and shouted, death to the Queen, fascist regime. And yet we pogoed along, and yeah, okay, I can see where you're coming from. And of course, Johnny Rotten lived long enough to say that he actually quite respected the Queen as a human being, but still, still hated the monarchy as a kind of institution. So, performers will always be one bit ahead of wherever you're at. And yet the kind of range of ideas that are coming out, the chance that whatever it is, they're all within the range of what people now find acceptable to feel. And that's because they have been watching over and over all sorts of imagery. If the BBC and the powers that be think that all anyone's watching these days are the carefully measured little teaspoons of reality that are kind of allowed in their news broadcasts, they're well wrong. People are watching everything that's pitching up on YouTube. I hope they're watching Channel 4 News, which has got far, far better coverage. And they're making their own judgments as to how casually, and the revelations that, the IDF soldiers were ordered to fire on refugees. I mean, that sounds quite antiseptic in some of the videos that are shown around Bob Vylan. You see mass graves with bodies in body bags being submerged under huge amounts of soil being pushed in by big industrial diggers. And I don't know, because I didn't, look to see, is that right? Is that those people? What am I seeing here? But you can't end up with 50 people being killed every day and them not ending up in a mass grave somewhere. That is happening. So if you're not going to kind of unwrap the bald statistics, because for whatever reason this subject alone seems to leave you unable to do proper journalism, then other people will, and these are not images that are kind of unreal to what's happening. So anyway, God knows what will happen. I see that there's, however, on the other side, Tim Davie, the Director General, who was apparently at Glastonbury when the outrageous Kneecap and Bob Vylan stuff happened. The kind of usual suspect papers are now calling for him to be sacked, or somebody's head to roll for, the decision to broadcast it. And I notice on the tail end of Good Morning Scotland, they had somebody on, didn't catch who, it was their entertainment correspondent. I mean, it's the ludicrousness of this, isn't it? That the only way we get to talk about Palestine is in the entertainment correspondent slot. But he was saying the problem for the BBC is that they've made the Glastonbury streaming into a big part of their summer programme. And of course, they ain't in charge of it. And by gum, does the BBC like to be in charge of stuff? It likes to produce things. It likes to control the agenda. It's extraordinary how much control has now been subject over live events, except this one.
Yep. I mean, even before he started his chant, Bob Vylan had in the background on the video screen, "Free Palestine. The United Nations have called it a genocide. The BBC have called it a conflict." It was
Yeah.
there was a lot of criticism of the BBC all throughout the Glasgow performance. But
But there's the problem for them. I mean, as with everything in life, they're desperately running around trying to create a balance on life and a control on life, which I mean, somebody who worked within it for 25 years, I was not averse to the notion that you need to get all sides of something in there, but you've now reached the stages where this is utterly, utterly ludicrous, and their idea of balance is being shot to pieces, ironically, by their desire to get to look doing with the kids by covering Glastonbury so that the po-facedness of them isn't apparent. And I'm sure that actually your man Davy was in the Rod Stewart set stage, while while all this stuff was going on. So the thing is, it's like the many worlds that there are. It's the many stages of Glastonbury, where doubtless some people could be going for the sort of armchair set, although I quite appreciate it's no armchair getting into Glastonbury and standing in unbelievable heat. And I'm sitting here in a glorious 14 degrees here in Stornoway when it's the other big headline at the moment is that people are this is forecast. I don't know if it's in Britain or Europe that 4,000 people will die over the next week. I think it must be Europe, the mainland,
well, yeah,
because of the
there's
heat.
a heat dome over Europe. We've got 40-degree temperatures in places of France, Portugal. Me and the Mrs. Thompson and the Tiny Thompsons are off to Greece at the end of the week, and
Oh God.
just about hopefully going to have 35 rather than 40, because that might just really push it to the extreme. But again, this puts huge amounts of pressure on tourist infrastructure. I was in Catalonia last year around October time, and they hadn't had any rain. They should have been at the end of their tourism season and be expecting to kind of have a kind of inclement autumn, and it was still the height of summer. And all of your tourists, of course, use vast amount of additional resources. Have a shower in the morning, and then they have a shower in the afternoon if they're feeling a bit too hot, and then you have a cold bath at night time. So the amount of water resources taken up by tourists, as you said, putting the pressure on the Canaries and elsewhere is, really getting to breaking point.
It's there for everybody. I mean, we, sitting over on the East Coast as well, there's hardly been any rain for ages. The wee loch that I swim in, the temperatures got up to around 18 degrees. It's part of the rest of the other lochs are for anglers, and it's stocked with fish. And I think once, I'm no expert, so here we'll be just getting all the emails in. But once it gets to about 20 degrees, the fish start to die, and they're there now, so and of course the thing is, here we are talking about climate change just as a tail end of something else, and that also, got to say, in the subjects that were potentially going to be discussed at question time, climate change was down as one of them, and then just dropped off the end. So, but this is what happens. You know what you said at the beginning? The excuse given by Keir Starmer with the disability stuff is he was being distracted by Iran, all the, Russia, all the international stuff that's going on. And the point is that everybody's attention, if you let other stuff come in, as and sort of fester like this and reach into everybody's attention span, so nobody's got time to deal with the big, big thing in the corner. And that's what's happening to climate change, because it's falling off every agenda because all of this stuff looks more urgent. But here we are again, well, almost frying tonight, but I wouldn't have thought here in the Western Isles. So probably that'll mean even more tourists coming, trying to get away from the heat. But anyway, I hope you have a great. Are you near the water in Greece? You must
Oh
be.
yes, absolutely. So
Right.
and I'll not be going for any walks over a mountain or anything ridiculous. I think we don't normally go for lying down holidays. This is my first lying down holiday in a long time, and I've been told under no certain circumstances that it's to be a lying down holiday, and I have to just go and relax, and we're not doing any city type stuff.
Right. But you can still swim.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't be swimming in your loch, 18 degrees or otherwise. That's for.
Well, I was out this morning, actually. I was up early this morning and went for a swim up on Gress Beach, which is a very famous part of Gaelic and sort of land reform history, because there was a tremendous rally against the landowner of the time in the 1910s, 20s, at Gressbridge with an incredible statement made, which is carried in a book by Roger Hutchison about the dignity of all the sort of little houses that were disdained by the landowner, and yet there was more love in it than probably anything he'd ever experienced. And that was read at Gressbridge. So there's a fantastic memorial there, which has always stuck in my mind. And the sea is pretty tasty as well. The only thing is, it's such a sweeping bay, and it was low tide. It took me about half an hour to get out deep enough to actually swim. So that note to self. But you just got to grab these moments while you can, and yeah.
Well,
It's
I
gonna
think
be
we'll be very much looking forward to finding out how you get on at the NORA conference when we report back next week. And, is that the kind of thing that normal countries would actually have in their news?
no, to be really honest, because having attended loads of these kind of um, Nordic Council and Arctic Circle and all these things, there is almost nothing of what we would call news in there because actually it's all about cooperation. And I mean, I've gone into this feeling like sometimes like a bull in a china shop because as an adrenaline-fueled news junkie brought up on a diet of conflict, I'm looking for that as news, and there isn't any. So actually, and actually, even in yeah, sometimes their own countries will say, this thing has been on, and the foreign minister of so and so said they were very pleased as to announce a new cooperation agreement with the Faroes, and you think, God, but that really is it. I've been to press conferences where nobody asked any difficult questions. Are you going to be drilling for oil in the Lofoten Islands? You know, almost passed over with somebody else asking, are we going to have a cooperation agreement between Lofoten and Finland or something? So it's very different. It's very much more gentle, and yet these are blooming hard-nosed people because they've got solutions. Here we are. I'm having to do talk to you, and there was a little disturbance in the force when I was foolish enough to Google for something on my phone. Currently, because I don't know why, I'm having to tether to speak to you on the laptop through my phone to be online. Just north of us here with the Faroes, and there's so many Faroese people, they have the world's fastest mobile broadband. It's like all these countries have got solutions to things that are still struggling with so much at the time here. So that's what I take from it. But of course, that's their normal, so they hardly even notice. I'll bet you they notice the Wi-Fi here,
Oh, I
though.
bet you they noticed the Wi-Fi, that's for sure. I mean, we've got pretty much 99.9%. We've missed a couple of syllables in what you were speaking about earlier, but nothing that we'd lost the gist. But I mean, talking about Nordics and Finland particularly, the Finland film crowdfunder has reached 50%. It's got 30 days to go, and you're already halfway.
Oh, that's brilliant. I hadn't checked it just very recently, but I know people have been in touch with me to say when they've made, a couple of people have made really big, generous donations, for which thank you so much. And it is quite a vote of confidence. There's a couple of people actually stopped me on the ferry. I think when you've had your kipper on Question Time, they're more confident to come up and speak to you because they've got an idea what you look like. And they were saying, so when's the film from about Finland coming on? It's like, you can't just magic these things out of nowhere. But on the other hand, it's great that people have got some sort of, I mean, and the thing is, Finland is like, I mean, I don't know, forgive me if I've said this before, but it is like your last Monroe or your final Polo. It's not a country I think people have immediate connections with because most people haven't been to Finland. A lot of people have been to Copenhagen. So
Yep.
Denmark was like, yep, we know that. Our interest was piqued by a visit. We can relate to these guys. Finland. So we'll see anyway how that goes. I hope just on the story of it enough, these guys, as in many respects, they're so like us because they're not the sort of golden ones, if you like, of the Nordics in health or any sense at all. They had an appalling history of civil war once they became independent and then being invaded by the Russians in the Second World War, losing bits of their territory. They were an archduchy of Russia for a very long time. So they've had a really squashed down sort of experience. They had a different culture than the Nordic Asgard, the Odin and all the rest of it that people are now familiar with. They were told that was almost their mythology too. It wasn't. And it took Sibelius and other writers to valorize their own myth stories in the 1900s and 1920s. And so they've had so many similar sort of problems to the Scots of trying to realise themselves. Every time I do one of these films, I see in the country that we're looking at so many reflections of our own sort of situation. But Finland has got to be, in many respects, the mum and daddy of them all, I think.
Well, watch this space, folks. I can hardly wait for that to come out. The link to the crowdfunder will be in the podcast show notes again. And if you can support that, please do. And a big shout out to all of our supporters who are registered as pals or buddies supporting the podcast. That really helps the podcast continue. Particularly Mark McKenzie of Edinburgh. Mark, we have never had your proper email and we can't get in touch with you. So if you're listening, please drop me an email at podcast@lesleyriddick.com. And on that note, we'll see you next week, folks.
But we won't.
Oh, we will.
Oh, we will. Oh,
we will.
Right, that's me jumping the gun. So, when are you going to Greece then?
Well, I'm going to record from Greece because I'm a dedicated individual.
You're mad. I had no idea you were doing that.
I've even had special dispensation from Mrs. Thompson, who's normally not at all in favour of people doing work when they're away on holiday, even if they particularly enjoy it, or even if you happen to be in Disneyland Paris and the First Minister of Scotland has resigned and you need to, take press positions on things, or you're at, I'm going to say, Alton Towers and the Prime Minister has resigned. So normally, the moment I step away anywhere, some exciting thing, yeah. So you find yourself in the toilets at Disneyland Paris, looking at things on your phone and drafting statements.
Right. Okay. Well, do you know the thing that really impressed me about Gavin? I must stop calling him lad because he's not. It's just compared to me, he is, but he's probably in his late 20s. But he was talking about so all these little differences about Finland. He did some work at the weekend, and his employer got to hear about it, and he was brought in for a disciplinary interview for working at the weekend, and given a day off during the week and money in lieu.
Wow. Okay.
Yes.
Right. Let's get more of this. Right. And on that note, we will definitely see you.
Seriously, you shouldn't have to do the podcast from... Have we not got something potentially in the kitty that we can whip out for them?
We're doing that the week following.
Oh, right. You're off for 2 weeks?
Yes.
Right. Okay. Back. Well, so the toilet for 1 week.
We can compare and contrast Wi-Fi signals.
Okay, but just lest anything should go wrong, have a great holiday and we'll see what happens. Yes.
Great stuff. Okay. See you soon, folks. Bye now.